So, a quick lesson in game development, especially in 3D. Now, this is the old project, right? As you can see, this is the house. And if you take a look at this over there, there's something that says draw calls 3633. And if I continue turning, it gets higher and higher. And right below that is vertices. Now, these two numbers are high. For a low poly game like mine, they are high. And that's because the way I constructed this level was not the most optimal. So, I had to redo the entire thing again. And now this is how it looks right now. Even controlling is a bit smoother. And if we take a look at the draw calls, they are much less. So basically, when it comes to 3D, especially 3D in real time or runtime, like a game engine, you want your draw calls to be low. Your vertices can be high, but you generally want your draw calls to be low. And draw calls are the number of times 3D meshes are displayed on screen, I guess. So if you have like 1,000 boxes on screen, each time you like render a box into view, that's a draw call. An element into view, that's a draw call. And this also takes into account the texture that is attached to those like boxes or objects. I'm not 100% being accurate. I'm just trying to paint a picture. Now, the reason why you want to be mindful of this is that this causes your game to be quite slow, and right now it's quite responsive as opposed to the previous one, which is a bit laggy and choppy. To solve the problem of draw calls, you want to do two things. One is that you want to make sure that you have what we call a texture atlas. Now, I'm not going to show you what a texture atlas is, but basically think of it as just one entire image that holds the texture of all the objects that you'll display in your game. And you technically want to do that so that you load one image. It can be huge, and it usually is huge, especially for like really large, ambitious games, but it's called once. It's saved into memory once, as opposed to having 1,000 different PNGs in your folder. Now, this does depend on the type of game you're working on, but if you really want to create a game that performs better, you tend to go down the route of using one texture atlas, is what it's called, if I have not mentioned it already. And so, yeah. If you're doing, more complicated games like, PS3, God of War types, you probably want a single texture for each, like, character model. Anyway, so that's texture atlas. The second thing you want to do is make sure that to keep your draw calls low, is to make sure that you merge as many, objects as possible. If you, for example, walk into a room that's full of crates or boxes or things, and each of them is an individual, like 3D object, why create them as separate objects? If you've done 3D, then you probably understand what exactly I'm talking about. If these elements are not, interactable, they're just like environment props, why not combine all of them into just one single object so that it is drawn once? There is a downside to this, but it really depends on the type of game you are making. If, for example, you walked into a living room. Now, maybe I should set this down so that I can illustrate this a bit better. If, for example, let's walk in here. All right, I think you can see that. If, for example, you walk into a room like this, and all these items that you see in front of you are static, there is no need for each individual item to be separate, right? There is no need for this couch to be, detached from this one, detached from this one. Now, you probably think attached and detached as being physically connected, but they don't need to be physically like touching. They can all exist in one mesh or one 3D object separate from each other. And this will reduce the number of draw calls that you know, sort of force on your game engine. And these are things I'm just learning as I go. But 3D is difficult, especially when it comes to optimization. Anyway, so yeah, that's why this thing is going to be taking this. That's why this thing is taking quite some time. Now I managed to basically. Let me put this into this perspective. Basically, have been able to get it back to working the way I want. I've changed some of the textures, so things are updated. Things look, well, in my opinion, a bit better. And generally, the performance is great. Before, the performance was terrible, and it was getting worse. And I wasn't even, you know, like halfway through the project. But now, at least. Spooky basement. So yeah, that's your lesson on draw calls and texture atlases. It's a pain to make 3D games.